Thanks again for joining. So last week we spent a fair bit of time looking at taking a second look at operating systems, and we talked a bit about, we were using our Linux system, which was either your VirtualBox or whatever, or the terminal emulator or the Ubuntu subsystem. So that was all well and cool. But today we're not going to be talking about operating systems. We're going to take a lower look at your computer, and we're going to be looking at computer hardware and computer architecture. So that's the name of the game today. So now, so a few things before we start, right? So normally at the Coder Dojo in IBM for computer architecture and computer hardware, we used to actually, I used to bring the hardware with me and show you. And that was great, but now obviously with the pandemic and the virtual nature of these sessions, we can't do that. But nevertheless, I'm going to try and make this as interactive as possible. And what I have here, I'm going to be turning on my webcam for this session. Just bear with me, there we go. I'm going to be turning on my webcam, so I'm going to put that on now. Just 1 second there. There we go. Hello, everybody. Oh, it's the wrong camera. Bear with me a second now. I want to switch to the other camera. So I have my, here we go. I have my other computer up on my desk, or sorry, my own. Oh, this should switch the cameras now, I hope, to be able to see it. Yes? No? No? Camera. Oh, maybe I need to stop sharing my hand. I need to turn my camera off to turn it on again, I think. Hang on. No. Caleb, how are you today?
Thanks, how are you?
I'm good. Can I transfer ownership of the meeting to you for a moment? Because I think I need to, I selected my Logitech Tech camera, which is the better one
Yeah.
I see here, in the meeting settings, and it's not actually changing. Hang on, actually, maybe just another way. Hang on. Oh, this will work. Hang on. There we go. That's better. Okay, thanks. Sorry, I was gonna transfer ownership of the meeting to you, and I'd log out and log back in. But fortunately, we don't need to do that. That's cool. Thank you, Caleb, for entertaining my thoughts.
No worries.
Oh, and that reminds me, I have to turn off the text talk so that only people can send me messages. I'm supposed to disallow that. Assign privileges. There we go. Okay. So now, so what we're gonna do. So yeah, I'm here. You can all see me. Hello. So here, I have my own desktop computer. Well, it's not taken apart, but I have brought it up. It normally sits under my desk. I have brought it up onto my desk, and we're gonna take it apart, and I'll show you the major pieces of the computer, okay? The reason we want to do this is because, as I was saying last week, we were looking at operating systems, and we talked about things like scheduling processes for time in the CPU, which is in there. I might need to angle that a bit better in a minute. So we talked about these things, but now you'll get to see what that actually corresponds to in physical terms, right? That's important. So I want all of you to kind of think about this and relate what we're going to see here in the actual physical machine today back to what we've talked about in operating systems before. Now I'm going to turn this. Sorry, now guys, I'm going to turn this screen over here. There we go. And I'm going to angle that. So leave it there for the minute. Okay, I'll be grabbing the camera and I'm going to pull it over to the system then. Okay, so hands up. Has anybody built their own computer before and wants to tell us about how it went? Nobody has built their own computer before. That's cool. So hopefully that means that this will all be of interest to all of you. If you ever thought about building a computer and what's required to put it together. So. And those of you who have been to the Coder Dojo, this is my own desktop computer that I used back when we had Games Day. Is that what we used to call that? Oh, it's been so long ago. So this is my computer. So I've taken off the side, the cover on the side here, so we can see into the computer. I have things like my processor, my graphics card, and my sound card, and other stuff in there, obviously. And I'm going to take them out piece by piece, and we'll look at each part. Okay. Now, not only is this session about computer hardware, but it's also about computer architecture. Okay. And what that means is what we need to talk about is some of the things that you will not see with the kind of the naked eye. Okay, so I can show you the processor from my desktop here, and I will in a minute. I'll have to unscrew. I have my screwdriver. Okay, so I'll show that to you in a minute. So I'll take it out so I can show you the processor. But I mean, I can hold the processor up in front of that, some other hardware here, like hard drives, to show you in a minute or later. But I can't really. We can't really talk about what the processor is doing just by showing it to you, okay? So I have some diagrams that I will be showing. I will be sharing my screen from time to time, and I'm going to be showing you some diagrams of what's happening underneath the hood of my Intel processor, Pci Kelly, right? I'll show you, and these diagrams, they come from the slides that I used to use at Coder Dojo when I used to teach these sessions, okay? So as I said to some of you at the start, we did computer science classes at the dojo before. I had slides with things on them, including diagrams. So I'm going to be bringing those up today. We're not going to be walking through slides. That's not what this is all about. I'm just bringing up the slides so I can show you the diagrams. So we can, when I show you the processor, you'll be able to see from the diagram what's actually going on inside the processor. That's important. Otherwise, it's not really a computer architecture class. It's a bit like doing physics or chemistry in school. You need to, you know, especially in chemistry, you can't really see, you know, ions of atoms moving and jumping about, or electrons expelling energy easily. Okay, so we need to talk about some of these things using the diagrams to help us out. Is that okay with everybody? Does anybody have any questions before we start? No. Okay, that's good. Okay. Feel free to jump in at any time if you're having trouble seeing anything, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the CPU, or the processor. Because we talked a lot about that over the last two sessions in terms of the operating systems and scheduling processes, our Discord or our WebEx or whatever, to get some time in the CPU. So it's only fair that we start there. Okay, now I have my phone here to act as a torch as well, but I'm going to try and take the processor out of the computer and show it to you, okay? So we talked about the processor before. The processor is essentially the brain of the computer. And what exactly do we mean when we say it's the brain of the computer? The processor does all the work. It executes all the instructions, okay? Think of the Python programs that we've looked at before. We've seen samples of Python programs where, for example, we could do something like we could say result equals 2 plus 3. So a variable called result, unless it equal to 2 plus 3. Python is going to add 2 and 3 together. It's going to get 5 and then store 5 in your variable. Okay? That's a very simple operation, but that operation is performed by the CPU itself. The CPU knows how to add numbers together. It knows how to do a lot of things, and we're going to see some of those during the session today. Okay? So I guess what I'll do now, I'm going to put on my my anti-static strap here before I go on my computer. Now I have loosened some of the screws on my motherboard here in preparation for this, because I don't want to spend the entire session just having me take screws out of the computer. So I'm going to remove this now. I have a liquid cooling system on top of my CPU, kind of a loop. It's not a full reservoir system. It's just kind of a loop, and I don't want to lose my CPU screws there. So I have to take that off to be able to see the CPU, which I've now done. Okay, so I've just pulled that to the side for the moment, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try this. I've never done this before, now bear with me. I'm not sure can people see that. Okay, it says enough like that. There we go. That silver box in the middle, that is my processor. As part of that is my Intel. Geez, I don't know what I can't remember what model of processor it is. It's been so long since I bought it. That shows how out of touch I am with some of these things. That is my Intel processor. And now you'll see the top of it is actually covered in what word am I looking for here, Caleb? What's on top? Or
Thermal paste.
Thank you. The thermal paste. Yeah, my processor is covered in thermal paste, and the thermal paste is there. You can see there's some of it. That is the heat sink that sits on top of the CPU. So what you see there, that actually touches the CPU, and the thermal paste is designed to prevent the CPU, which gets very hot, from actually sticking to this guy. Okay, because that can happen. If you're playing games on your computer, your CPU, of course, might reach temperatures in excess of 90 degrees Celsius. Okay, now that is the CPU, but I don't want to show it to you like that. I actually want to take it out of the computer if I can. I might come to regret this, but it's in the name of education, right? So let me see now. I'm going to there's a little clip here on my motherboard holding it in. I'm going to undo the clip. This, of course, is not the right way up for doing this kind. I should really have the computer lying down, but that would be awkward with the webcam. So I'm going to oh, hang on, screw down. I beg your pardon. There's another screw holding the cover in place. I can take that off. Oh no, that's not a screw holding it in place. Oh, there it is. So there we go. Here we go. Is to grab it very carefully. Like the case lifted up, cover lifted up. Have it. Right. Now I'm not going to wipe the thermal paste off of it because I don't have any left. There we go. So that is your computer processor, the CPU. Okay. That every time you write a Python program or whatever, or every time you write HTML for a website, this is what executes all the instructions to execute your Python program or render your HTML. This, as Powergas, is an Intel CPU. If I was to wipe away the thermal paste, it does say Intel on it. Okay. It only goes one way into the computer. If we look at the back of it there, that's what actually touches down onto the motherboard itself. So these are the pins that interface with the motherboard. Okay, so that is our CPU. It's very small, isn't it? It's not very big, but it can do a lot of work. Okay, and in fact, it does all the work. Right. So that is our processor. Does anybody have any questions about that, or is there anything anybody wants to see? Bear in mind, just if you want to ask a question, I'm holding the camera with one hand and the processor with the other hand. So feel free to unmute yourself and just ask the question, because I don't want to touch my mouse while I'm holding these two things. No? Okay, so we're all happy with the processor. That's good. Okay, so that is our processor, our little square box. Okay, now let me put the camera up there for a second. Okay. I'm just gonna, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna try and fasten it back into my computer for a moment, just so that it's not. I don't want to put it down on a desk. It's fragile. Please don't make me regret this now. Say something motivational, Caleb.
Who's that by the door?
Actually don't have that properly in place, but it will suffice for now. Okay, thanks, Katie. That's very motivating. There's an intruder at the door. Oh, well, I can't give you my money. My hands are occupied by my processor.
They just came for the processor part.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's fair enough. They leave me alone. Okay, very good. Okay, so that is the processor of the computer. Okay, now we just saw a little square box, but what is the processor doing? Okay, now this is where I'm going to share my screen for a moment. This one here. Okay. Does that work? Oh, sorry, guys. I was sharing the wrong screen. Bear with me a second now. Share. This one, sorry. Okay. That is our processor. So I'll just up here. So don't mind the fact that there's slides. This is Dojo. Gee, I wrote these in 26th of May 2018. Goodness me. Michael, just what journey have you been taking us on so far? Who knows? Right, there we go. So there's our CPU, our central processing unit. So that's just like what I showed you. I just held that for real. Okay, that picture there, that's obviously an Intel Core i7. Okay, we've talked about what it does. One thing I mentioned here in my notes is that these days, and we talked about it before last week, a CPU processor can have multiple cores. And if it has multiple cores, your CPU can do more than one thing at a time. Okay. Now, this is the diagram I wanted to show you. Okay, so can I zoom in on that? There we go. Okay, so this is a simplified view of the CPU that we just looked at from my trusty computer. Okay, this square box is what we just looked at. Okay, the central processing unit, and you can see there's a couple of different. So underneath that silver lid that was on my processor, there's a couple of different components. Okay. What we have, let me see now, we have at the very top here, we have this thing called the control unit. And the control unit is essentially what's coordinating all the actions of the processor, okay? All the inputs and outputs of the processor. Remember now, when you write a Python, just like I mentioned a few minutes ago, when you write a Python program that, for example, adds two numbers together, that instruction to add your numbers together has to be sent into the CPU. So 2 plus 3 is the instruction that has to go into the CPU. The result, which is 5 in that case, right, is the output of the CPU. The control unit coordinates all that movement, but it's not actually what performs the operation. What performs the operation is this guy at the heart of the CPU, the arithmetic and logic unit, or ALU. That is, if there's a brain in your computer, it's inside the processor, and that is it, the arithmetic and logic unit. So what that does is it takes inputs, like the numbers from your program or any instruction, will perform some kind of operation on those pieces of data, and then give you back the result. Okay? What it actually takes in practice is binary numbers. Now, we haven't spoken about binary in this class because binary, if we have extra time towards the end of our sessions in late August or early September, we can take a look at binary numbers. But everything in your computer, of course, is in binary, zeros and ones, okay? So when I write a Python program that says 3 plus 5, what's going to happen, the CPU does not know what the number 3 is. It doesn't know what the number 5 is. What it understands is the binary representations of those numbers. So it will take in the number 3 in its binary form, which looks like this. Actually, I have to be able to say 3 in binary is what is it? It's 0, 1, 1. That's 0, 1, 1 in decimal. That's 3, isn't it? Yes, I'm right. There. So 0, 1, 1 is 3, and 5, for example, is 1, 0, 1. So your CPU actually reads these numbers. It doesn't read 3s and 5s. It only reads sequences of 0s and 1s. A lot like the Boolean logic we looked at, eh? Okay, so it takes those pieces of data in, and it can perform some operation on them. And those operations can either be arithmetic operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, or they can be Boolean operations. And we looked at Boolean operations as well, didn't we? And, or, not, things like that. Those are the operations that your CPU, your processor, just like mine in there, can perform on pieces of data. Okay, and that's all done by the arithmetic and logic unit. So that is the heart of your CPU that performs all the data. The CPU also consists of these things here called registers. Registers, your CPU, different CPUs have different kinds of registers. Registers are simply storage locations. One register can store one piece of data in binary format, zeros and ones. We don't really want to be talking, we won't be talking a lot about those. There's one very interesting register, though, that we will mention. Is something called the program counter, PC. And it's a register that holds the address of the next instruction of the current program. What do I mean by that? I'm going to bring over my one of our solutions to our exercise, to one of our Python exercises that I gave. Here, this is an instruction in my Python program. This is something that the CPU can perform. This is the next instruction in my program, this line here. If I if my CPU is running this Python program and it's performing this instruction, then the program counter register holds the location in memory of the next instruction of the program. That's this one in this case. So the computer always has to know, where do I finished this task. Where is the next task coming from? What do I have to do next? What code do I have to execute next for the running program? So the program counter keeps track of that, okay? The thing about registers is that they're very fast. They're located on the physical chip that I took out of the computer. The registers are right there. So your CPU, the ALU, can pull information from those registers very, very quickly. All right? And then that's all we're actually going to talk about there, okay? And then this is the second diagram I want to show you in terms of talking about the CPU. This is specifically the arithmetic and logic unit inside your CPU, okay? If you were to draw an electrical circuit that contains an arithmetic and logic unit, this is what it would look like. It's shaped a bit like a V. You see the V kind of shape. So in simple terms, your arithmetic and logic unit in your processor can take two inputs, A and B. Ignore the status, okay? I don't want to talk about that. Just think of the two inputs, A and B. And then think of this other thing over here on the left-hand side, an opcode. This is how your ALU knows what to perform. The opcode is the instruction. So the opcode is something like add, multiply, subtract, divide. Okay, so if I bring this Python program back here, and I'll just come down the bottom here, and if I do result equals 3 plus 2, think of that compared to the diagram. We have two operands. Here's the first one, 3. So 3 is A. The second operand is the 2. That's integer operand B. Of course, the binary versions of these, as I mentioned. And then the opcode is the action that your arithmetic and logic unit should perform on these things. That's the plus, the addition. So that is manifested to your arithmetic and logic unit as an instruction. The opcode is to add 3 and 2. And then at the output of the ALU, Y down here, you get your result, which in this case, of course, is 5. Okay? So that's it in very simple terms. That's how your CPU can execute instructions. It's the same thing then for things like for Boolean logic. If I'm going to do, I don't know, another result equals, I don't know, true and false. Well, that needs to be uppercase T and an uppercase F. If we were to run this instruction, true would be operand A, B would be operand, sorry, I beg your pardon. True would be operand A, false would be operand B, and then the logical AND instruction here would be the opcode, a Boolean AND. So this, my friends, is how your CPU can actually execute programs. So when you write your Python code or your JavaScript code or Kotlin code in Caelim's case, well, I should say Caelim and Victor here, shouldn't I really? This is what your CPU is doing. This is how it knows how to execute each instruction in your code. Okay? And we know the result of this, of course, would be false, because for an AND condition to be true, both inputs need to be true. Just recapping the Boolean logic there. Okay? So I hope that's given you, and I was giving examples here of the opcodes: add, subtract, multiply, divide, move. Don't worry about that for now. There we go. So that is our CPU. Okay, that is the CPU, and that's how it executes instructions. It's primarily the arithmetic and logic unit. Okay. Is there any questions about any of that, guys? Or feel free to put your hands up or whatever. Surely there must be some questions. I'm sure you've never looked at a CPU in that level of depth before. Conroll, whoever you are, Conroll.
Hello?
Is that you, Connor Browman?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, your username is Conroll.
Oh, I misspelled.
That's grand. How are you today, Connor?
I'm grand, how are you?
Good. I'm well, thank you. What's your question?
I was asking, code have to be like, no, never mind. I just read.
What were you gonna ask out of interest?
I was going to ask about the opcode, and then I realized that you already said it.
Yeah. Okay. So the opcode,
Yeah.
these are actually CPU specific. So I mean, Parag, you said at the start, was that Intel or was it, or I assume you wanted me to say it was a an AMD processor, right? But different CPUs will have different representations of opcodes. Things like, there's way more than this. Your CPU can do way more than this. But things like add, subtract, multiply, divide, they're pretty standard, whether it's Intel architecture or AMD architecture, or even say on your mobile phone where it's likely to be, come on guys, what's the architecture on a mobile phone going to be? What am I thinking of? Well, you know, what am I, say it again, Caleb? ARM, that's it. Thanks, Caleb. You're a star. Okay, ARM, exactly. Those things are likely to be, yeah, thanks, Connor. Those are likely to be the same, pretty standard, you know. Very good. Any other questions or any comments from any of our mentors who are working like Caleb or studying in college?
Maybe your phone uses ARM. Mine's x86.
Say that again, Caleb. x86 what?
Maybe your phone uses ARM. I'm rocking an x86 phone.
No, I don't
The
think
battery
so.
lasts about 2 hours.
Oh, really? Yeah. I have, you know, you might remember these slides, Caleb. I have a picture of the Intel 8086 down here. Look at how processors have evolved, everybody. That's an Intel 8086 processor from 1978.
That's before it becomes a butterfly, right?
Yeah, exactly. Before it becomes a butterfly, yeah. And if you ever see in your Windows systems, guys, where you see x86, you know, that's derived from this Intel processor, the Intel 8086, because it's what's known as its instruction set architecture of modern Intel processors, at least, were derived from this very famous processor. I could not do a session about computer architecture and not bring up the Intel 8086 CPU. So as Caleb said, it was before it became a butterfly. Do you know what we should talk about while we're here, actually? Another thing you might find interesting, 32 bits versus 64 bits. I have something, and I should have, oh, there we go. 32-bit versus 64-bit, what does this mean? See, I anticipated all the questions 3 years ago, right? Your modern processor, your Intel or your AMD processor is likely to be either 32, well, it's actually unlikely to be 32 bits these days. It's more likely to be 64 bits. But if you go back 10 years, your processor was likely either to be 32-bit or 64-bit. But what does that mean? And what that is, it's the size of the A and B inputs and the registers in the CPU. It's the length of the binary numbers you can take in. Let's go up here back to this diagram. What we're saying is that 32-bit versus 64-bit, it's the size of A and B in binary. If I come up here to the address bar, think of it this: a 32-bit processor could take in a binary number that's 32 digits long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. That's the maximum size that A or B could be. Now, I'm not, and the highest number, I'm not sure what's the highest number that you can Google it after, I don't know off the top of my head. What's the highest decimal number that could be represented with 32 binary digits known as bits? It's 32 bits. Each digit here is a bit. So there we go. That's what 32-bit refers to. But in a 64-bit CPU, the size of A and B can be 64 bits. So that's another 32 bits. There we go. That's double the length. So your CPU can operate on bigger size inputs and numbers. Okay, that's what it means to be 32-bit versus 64-bit. And if I'm not mistaken, and I'm hoping that people like Alan and Thomas, especially being in UCC, maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't. the Intel 8086 processor, or maybe one of you could Google this while I'm talking. I think this is a 16-bit processor. Do one of you know that off the top of your heads?
It is a 16-bit.
It is a 16-bit processor, yeah. So thank you, Alan. Very good. So what does that mean, guys? So that means your CPU can only do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. It's half of 32, of course. So that was the maximum size of input that you could take. So let's see now, if we maximum int 30. There's a sign of the times, guys. Look at the search recommendations. Maximum interval between Pfizer vaccine doses and AstraZeneca doses.
But why aren't you doing 2 to the power 16?
There we go. Well,
That's signed.
you want me to do this, Caleb?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there you go. 65,536. So that is the maximum integer number that you could take. All right. I haven't explained the powers of 2 thing, Caleb.
Okay, reasonable.
Yeah. So that is the max. But Caleb's right. If you do 2 to the power of n, I mentioned this, by the way, in the solutions videos to last week's exercises, or the exercises from the Boolean work that I did. I posted them during the week. 2 to the 16. So that's the maximum number. So the maximum integer number. Let's keep this in simple now, guys. Let's not think people like Caleb and Alan and Thomas, except Victor. Let's not think of 2's complement here or anything like that. Let's just keep it simple. That's the maximum number. That's the maximum number that your CPU could take in, 65,536. Whereas if you're 32, you're this number, and if you're 64, you're this number. It's the same result. Oh yeah, it's so big it doesn't even show up in the calculator. It's the maximum size of your inputs to your ALU. So that's what it means to be 32-bit or 64-bit. The maximum size of that. Okay. Anything else I should add to this, Alan or Caleb or Thomas or Victor? What do you think? Anything else we should bring up here that might be of interest to you, people who play games and whatnot?
Signed, unsigned.
Speak up, Thomas. Your volume is very low.
Difference between signed and unsigned.
Oh, but we won't go there. Well, yes. Well, maybe we should mention it very briefly. Is that of course your CPU has to deal with positive numbers and negative numbers, and we call these signed numbers, right? So if you have a 6, let's bring Kevin. Let's do 2. We'll do 2 to the 16 again. Thomas, you might help me remember what's the formula for this, right? If you have a 16-bit system, and it's 2's complement, which means that it can represent positive numbers and negative numbers. Is it 2? The maximum number it can represent will be 2 to the n minus 1, right?
I
feel like I have that wrong.
The maximum number up, as in positive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
What's maximum number up and maximum number down?
Yeah, that would halved.
Oh, yes, it's half. So, yeah, what it is, yeah, it's half. Sorry, it's 2 to the 15. It's 2 to the n minus 1, isn't it?
Yeah, minus 1.
Yeah, that's it. There we go. Thank you, Thomas. I'm beginning to show my age, guys. I'm sorry. If your inputs on your processor A and B can only support 16 bits in length, and your computer has to support negative numbers and positive numbers, the way we determine what's the maximum number, I've done that wrong. The way we can determine what's the maximum number that can be represented, basically, if you have 32 bits and you want to represent negative numbers and positive numbers, you have to split down the middle, okay? Because you have to represent each number that it can represent has to have a negative equivalent and a positive equivalent. So to represent all the negative numbers and all the positive numbers, you have to divide the space of your bits. And what we do, as Thomas said, is you halve it. So this isn't the best explanation in the world. Let me finish the explanation there, Ian, before you give your comment, right? What we do, instead of saying 2 to the 16, which was 65,000 and whatever it was, we reduce by 1 bit. That halves the number of numbers available. So we've gone from 65,000 to 32,000 minus 1. That's the maximum positive number that can be represented. The maximum negative number that can be represented is the negative of 2 to the 15. If I do minus 1 multiplied by this, oh, Google can do that. Hey, there we go. Minus 32,768. So if you have 16 bits and you want to represent negative numbers and positive numbers, this is how we do it. We divide our addresses in half. Half of them are for the negative numbers and half of them are for the positive numbers. That was an explanation I was not ready to give, but it was a good point to bring up, Thomas. Do you want to add anything to that, Thomas? Maybe you can do a better job explaining it than I can.
Instead of having like normal ways of thinking about positive and negative, 0 is considered positive with this, which you wouldn't do normally. That's why there's 1 less for positive numbers.
That's right, and there's no such thing as minus 0. That's the other thing. If we didn't do this, we'd be obliged to have a minus 0 and a positive 0. So, but we only want positive zeros, Thomas said, yeah. Okay, Ian, do you have a question, Ian?
I was just wondering, how do you actually tell the difference between a positive and a negative binary number? Because
Thomas, do you want to answer that?
A very good question.
It's a very good question.
You look at the
Let's get a number up. Let's get a positive number. Pick a number, Ian.
7.
Okay.
1.
Okay, 7 in binary, just for fun. Okay.
111.
Yeah, it's 111. Okay. Okay, so there's binary 7. Right, go ahead, Thomas. Explain.
If you know it's 2's complement, the most significant bit, which will be generally the leftmost bit, will be a 1. Otherwise, it'll be 0 and a positive. So all zeros will be 0. And all ones would be the greatest, the least, I guess, the smallest number you can get into his complement. So like the greatest negative number. That not minus 1, but minus however many, 65,000.
Numbers are hard, aren't they, guys? Do you know something, guys? This is why I deliberately left this out of the online sessions.
I see why now.
You see why? Let me put it to you like this, right? Thomas is right. The leftmost bit, which actually let's pretend in this case is the 0. The leftmost bit, which is over here, Ian. Okay, it's the number on the left, the farthest left-hand side. 0 means that it's a positive binary number. 1 means it's a negative number. That's exactly what Thomas was saying, right? But you have to know, as Thomas said as well, you have to know that you're in what's called a 2's complement number system, which is what we are when we're talking about our CPU here, to enforce that. So if let's ask Google, if I do this again, 7 in binary, 1111, or sorry, 111, 3 ones, okay? What if I do minus 7 in binary? Google doesn't know how to represent that. You see that? It's put a minus. That's not, I think you'd agree, Thomas, that's not exactly what we'd be hoping for here.
Well, that's just not 2's complement.
That's not 2, exactly. If you had a 2's complement system, we would say that 111 is, jeez, I went to use AHS. If you, right, let's do this. If you, hang on. Okay. Let's keep things simple here, Ian, okay? Let's assume that we only have 4 bits. Not 16 bits or 32. Let's assume we only have 4 bits. If we have 4 bits, as Thomas said, the leftmost digit, which is called the most significant bit, that's this one here. For a positive number, that's always 0. For a negative number, it's 1. So the way to represent a negative 7 would be to change the most significant bit here, 0, to be 1. That would be a negative 7 in very simple terms. Okay. But do you see how we need to reserve 1 bit so that our computer system recognizes whether it's positive or negative? That's why we have the 2's complement. That's why it reduces the number of go ahead, Ian.
So does that mean that a 16-bit system's maximum isn't actually 32,768 above, but like I mean above zero,
Above zero.
16,384. So 60,000 instead.
Correct. That depends on the individual processor, Ian, but generally yes. So if you have a 16-bit processor that uses 2's complement notation, the highest number will be 2 to the 8 minus 1. That's the highest positive number. Okay. Oh, sorry, no, what am I saying? Geez, sorry, guys, sorry. 2 to the 15. Sorry. Jesus. 2 to the 15. I need to go to sleep or something. It'll be 2 to the 15 minus 1 for a 16-bit processor that uses 2's complement notation to represent numbers. Okay? That's because we've lost one number because we need it to represent whether we're positive or negative. Okay?
Michael, actually, wouldn't it be to the power of 14?
For a 16-bit system?
Yeah, but no, but if for a 16-digit system, don't you lose a 1 at the end of, you lose
Oh, sorry.
so it's
Well,
actually to the
no,
power of 14.
no, no, it's, let me write it out here. It's difficult to write it in Google. And then we're going to move on from the subject. We have a lot to get through. Not that I want to dampen your questions. We have a lot more to talk about. I don't want to lose everybody, okay?
The one
It sounds
bit,
like we need to have this binary number session at some point. Go ahead, Caleb. Whoops.
yeah, the one bit that's used for the sign is what turns it from 16 to 15.
Okay,
I don't want to turn this off.
thanks.
That, can you see, that's the formula. That's the highest number. And actually, this shouldn't be a subscript. Well, it isn't subscript, is it? But I missed out on the number there, 41. There you go. I think that's the formula. You've lost one bit because you're 2's complement, so it's 2 to the 15, and then minus 1 because you have one less number to represent because you need to have a positive 0. That's the formula. It's actually, I believe, it's minus, to put it in its complete form. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. It's actually 2 to the n. The full range is 2 to the n. Sorry, it's minus 2 to the n minus 1, up to 2 to the n minus 1 minus 1. I think that's what it is.
Is it not minus 1 on the negative as well?
No, it's not minus 1 in the negative.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm delighted for your interest in it. This kind of makes me feel that we should do the session on binary numbers towards the end if we have time. But yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. Let's move. Thanks for the inputs, guys. That's excellent. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is that's our CPU, and we talked now. So now you know the difference between what was I saying? What are we talking about? 32-bit versus 64-bit. Okay. Now, let me get back up here. So now next, let me stop sharing the screen so you can see me again. No, hello. So the next thing we want to do now is I want to talk to you about is memory. Okay, we didn't talk about memory in our operating systems sessions, right? But memory is also very important. Okay, memory. So when hands up, everybody, when I say memory, what kind of memory do you think I'm talking about? Hands up, anybody. What memory in my computer do you think I'm talking about? One second, I can't see the participants window. Paul, Kelly, we'll go to you next.
RAM?
Yeah, absolutely, RAM. So I have RAM in my computer as well. So I'll get the camera. It's getting dark outside now, unfortunately. I'll turn my, hang on, get my, I got the torch on my phone. How would I angle this? There. I'm trying to watch my monitor at the same time and angle the camera. There's two, there, you see there's two sticks there. There's two vertical sticks running up and down. That's the RAM, the computer. And what does RAM stand for? Somebody unmute yourself and tell me.
Random access memory.
Very good to everybody who got that right. Yeah, random access memory. So it's like a stick. So what I'm going to do now, I'll go for a close. So that's on the motherboard. That's on the motherboard, and it's right there next to the CPU. Okay, it's right there next to the CPU. That's very important, so we'll come to that in a minute. You might not think it, but that's very important, okay? Now, because before we actually no, I won't even get into that yet, okay? Now let me put that back there for a second. I'm going to remove a stick of memory. I still have my strap on here. Come on, memory, there, help. Right, down here. So there's our RAM. That's our RAM, which is DDR4 RAM Vengeance LPX from Corsair. This is geez, what is it? This is I'm not sure, you probably can't read the label there. This is an 8 gigabyte stick of RAM. So I have 2 of them in my computer, so I get 16 gigabytes in total. So that's all it is, right? They come in many different shapes and forms. Processors tend to be kind of the same these days, like the square box we just saw, but memory can come in different forms. It can be a lot smaller than this, for example, not as tall. So it's just another chip. There's a coating around it here to prevent me from touching it, and it just plugs. You can see like the pins on the side there. It just plugs into my motherboard. Okay. Now memory for a program to run in your computer, it has to be in memory. Okay. When you run a Python program on your computer, so if you write, myprogram.py, that file has to be located in here before the CPU can run it. Okay? Everything that the CPU does, that we've looked at the CPU, everything the CPU executes, it has to come from in here. Or it's registers. Or it's cache. The CPU also has a memory device on board called a cache. It's just another form of memory. Okay? So it's registers or the cache. The registers and the cache are both located on the CPU chip, or it has to come from the RAM. The RAM is obviously external to the CPU. Okay, so that's what our RAM looks like. Okay, very long, very thin. And I want you to think of it vertically. I want you to, can I have a better background here? I want you to think of it vertically like this. Okay, the memory is organized into a series of cells. Think of the cells as running from left to right as you move down the stick of RAM, okay? And those cells can store data, again, binary data, 0s and 1s, okay? Now let me put this back up there for a second. Does anybody, before I put the RAM back into the computer, does anybody have any comments or want to say anything or any questions? Go ahead, Ian.
But you know how a hard drive has a stick and disk, and then the stick uses a magnet to flip a bit on the disk to a 1 or 0.
Mm-hmm.
How does the RAM do that?
RAM uses something called capacitors.
Oh, okay, yeah.
To do that. So a capacitor, I'm not sure, do you have it in your junior cert science anymore, but a capacitor is something that can hold an electric charge. So essentially think of the capacitor, if the capacitor is charged, think of it as a 1. If the capacitor is not charged, if it has no charge in it, think of it as a 0. So your memory, your RAM is just a series of capacitors. And that is also why the other key thing about RAM, I should say before I put it back in the computer. Excellent question, Ian. And I should have brought this up myself. The thing about RAM is that, of course, you all know this, I think. When you turn off your computer, your RAM is emptied. Everything that's in the RAM goes. So your RAM is not a permanent form of storage. It's what we call volatile. It loses all the data when the computer is turned off. And the reason that is because of what the answer to Ian's question. For data to remain in RAM, an electrical charge has to be applied to the RAM to keep the capacitors charged, either charged to represent a 1 or not charged to represent a 0. If your computer is turned off and there's no electric current flowing to the stick of RAM, then there's no way the capacitors in the stick of RAM are going to be able to keep their charges. So there's no way it can store any data when the computer is turned off. The thing about RAM is that it's like not quite as fast as the memory cache on the CPU or the registers on the CPU. RAM is very fast. RAM is very, very fast memory. Okay. It's also expensive. It's quite expensive. Okay. Unlike other forms of storage, which we will see before the evening is finished. Okay. So RAM is very fast. Okay. But because it's very expensive and it's big, like I said, this stick is only 8 gigabytes of RAM. You tend to get sticks of RAM that are, 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte, 4 gigabytes, 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes. I think you can get 128 now, I'm not sure. Increasing powers of 2. Increasing powers of 2, as Caleb alluded to earlier, are very important in computer science. So yeah, so it's not quite like your hard drive, which might store a terabyte of data. You certainly probably couldn't get, well, maybe you could, I don't know. I've never seen RAM, for example, that stores a terabyte. Does anybody want to comment what's the largest size of stick of RAM they've seen out there? While I put this back into my computer. The largest stick of RAM you've ever seen.
Pretty sure we have some 64 gig DDR3 RAM at NetSoc.
Oh, cool. NetSoc has made a lot of improvements since I left UCC.
Have you heard of a cold boot attack?
I know I've heard of that, Caleb, but I wouldn't know the details now, I must admit. Why don't you tell everybody about it?
It's just interesting. It's just an attack to compromise some data where people will physically cool down the RAM in a running computer, and then they'll move it after it's been cooled down. And because it's really cold, it's less volatile, and they have time to put it in another computer and just scan its contents.
Oh, that's very interesting, isn't it? I never actually, no, I don't think I've ever heard of that, Caleb.
Yeah, they'll use like compressed air upside down to like cool the RAM down, and then
Okay, that makes
quickly move
sense,
them
yeah.
out.
And is the idea, Caleb, that I think you said it there, but just clarify that you said if it's cooled, does it hold a charge for longer?
Yeah, it's
Which
less
is why you can
volatile.
transfer it. Yeah, less volatile, yeah.
So even if you have an encrypted hard drive, if your machine is compromised while it's on, then like unlocked,
Yes.
they can still get everything.
Of course, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Oh, nice. Oh, wow. Look at this, everybody. See what Ian has just shared with us. And let me share my screen now. I need to go back to the screen share anyway.
I couldn't send it to everybody for some reason, but I was able to send it to you.
That's disabled, yes. But yes, you can send it to me. And here it is for everybody. A 256 gigabyte stick. Well, actually, they're each 128 gigabytes of RAM. 6,900 euros. I bet that's for some kind of server. Yeah, Mac Pro.
My birthday is on the 19th of January, Michael, just so you know.
But that's next year, Ken, isn't it? We can't even talk about
Yeah, it'll
that
be a
yet.
while, but I'll give you
Mine's,
enough time
mine's
to say
tomorrow.
that.
Just
Yeah,
you know.
I suppose I do owe you for the wonderful birthday present I got for you for my birthday 2 weeks ago, right?
Mine's actually in a little over a week. It's coming up, just if anybody needs any hints.
Okay. Guys, you have to remember. You see now here, I'm in my new house now. I'm poor now. There was all those times I used to buy the Raspberry Pis or the Dojo with Chris. I certainly couldn't afford that now. Thank you for the inputs, guys. Okay. Well, if Ian's really good friend, now you know what to get him, and Caleb, of course. Now, what have I got in here about memory? I can't even remember. Memory. Memory is this isn't a slide. Oh yeah, I should have I've talked a bit. Don't worry, I think I've covered all this, but there's two things I should say there. There's two types of memory: primary and secondary memory. That goes back into what I was saying earlier about why the fact that the sticks of RAM are right next to the CPU. So primary memory, directly accessible by the CPU, accessed first when the CPU needs data from memory. So the CPU chip in my computer and your computers at home is able to, I'm using a screwdriver as a pointer, aren't we fancy? Let me turn my torch on here a second. The CPU can directly read memory from the stick, or can read data from the sticks of RAM. That's why the RAM is known as a form of primary memory. The CPU can access the RAM directly, and to do that, it uses something called a bus. Not a big red bus or a bus errand bus. A bus is like a pipe. for transferring data between two parts of the computer. The reason the CPU chip and the RAM are on the motherboard is so that there's a bus between them that allows the CPU to directly access the contents of RAM. Okay. We also talked, and other types of primary memory include the registers, which we talked about. They're on the CPU, and there's a cache on the CPU as well. That's also a form of primary memory. As we said, primary memory, typically it's very fast and it's very expensive, which is why, and it's volatile, which is why you only get limited, limited quantities of it, in terms of maybe 128 gigabytes like Ian showed us, but maybe more likely for people like you and me, 16 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes or whatever. Okay, so that's primary memory, the RAM. Okay, but then we also have secondary memory. Now we'll come to that in a second. Well, we'll come to it now. What am I saying? Let me turn off my screen there for a second, or not, sorry, turn off the screen share. Okay, secondary memory. Where else does anybody put their hands up? Where else can we store things? I see the chat has narrowed down into, like, if I can see all the messages. When is my birthday and how many months have I got left until I can buy you RAM? Can anybody tell me? We've talked about RAM. We've talked about the CPU chip, which has a cache and it has registers. Where else in the computer do you think we can store data? Hands up. That we haven't talked about. Niall Kelly, go for it.
A hard drive or a solid state drive?
Very good. A hard drive, exactly. A hard drive or a solid state drive. Thank you, Niall. Yeah. But you all have hard drives in your computer. They look like this. Oh, this is a hard drive. This is a Western. This is a Western Digital hard drive. What I'm trying to see, it's 750. You can't. The camera isn't very good. It's 750 gigabytes capacity. 750 gigabytes. That's a lot more than my RAM, which was, we saw, the 2, 6, or 8. So, and this is also, of course, a lot cheaper than the RAM. It's very cheap to buy these things these days in large quantities. And as Niall also said, not only do we have our hard drives, the reason we call this a hard drive is because I think Ian talked about it earlier. There's several spinning, if we were at IBM, Chris Murphy had some of these taken apart. We could show you. In fact, we showed the last batch of computer science people at the dojo. There's some discs, circular discs. They're called platters. They're inside here, and that's where the data is stored. Okay, and that's that's non-volatile. The data in here is persisted. It's stored permanently when the data is written to the disk. So you won't lose it when the computer is turned off. That's one form of secondary storage. And the other one, as Niall said, I have two of them here, is a solid, my aiming is terrible, is a solid state drive. They're a lot smaller. There's two of them there, actually. You can see the two of them. They're a lot smaller than the hard drive. And these have no spinning disks inside them, okay? So they tend to be a lot faster than the hard drive. To load something from the hard drive, the needle inside in your hard drive has to find the correct location on the disk where the data is stored and move to it. So that takes time. Solid state drives do not have a spinning disk, right? I'm actually unsure, like, how SSDs are what's going on inside an SSD. Does anybody want to contribute to the discussion and tell us what they know? How do SSDs store data inside them? Obviously, there's no moving parts, which is why they're so fast. But if I was to crack open an SSD, guys, what would we find? I've never done it, actually, so I don't know. Anybody know? Well then, guys, life goals is to crack open an SSD and see what it does.
It's similar to normal RAM. It, like, uses capacitors, and it does the same sweeping over to top up the I think that's how it works.
Well, the interesting thing about that, Thomas, of course, if it worked exactly like RAM, then the data would have
much
to be
cheaper
right when you turn it off.
True.
Like, what I can tell you is that an SSD drive is a bit like a USB stick. Same kind of principle. Okay. I think we all have a bit of learning to do there. Okay. Okay, that was so well done. Thanks, that now. So there's a storage, and in my computer, I have a case here. It's very dusty. I have turned the torch on again. Should have done this at the start of the summer when the days are bright. So I have these trays here, and I can pull out. Actually, that one's not coming out. There's another one in here. There's my hard drive there. You can see them locked in the computer, so I can store them away. I have a feeling when I move that, cables have to come out of the back of it. Okay. So yeah, secondary storage. So our so whether it's a USB stick, an SSD, a hard disk. I have another one here. Here's a blast from the past. This is an external hard drive. It's not solid state. It has a disk. This massive thing is a 250 gigabyte external hard drive that connects to your computer via USB. I bought this when I was a teenager. I'd say this is probably 15 years old, perhaps. I still have it. So they're all on CD-ROMs, DVD-ROMs, Blu-ray discs. I don't have any. Oh, actually, hang on, I do. Here I do. That's ridiculous. I've got Saving Private Ryan on 4K Blu-ray. So there's your Blu-ray disc. This is also a form of secondary storage. Inexpensive. It holds a lot of data. Well, the Blu-ray disc can hold a lot of data. Now, but why are they called secondary though? What's the difference? The difference, I'm going to bring the camera over. The difference, if we go back to the motherboard, the CPU at the back there, the CPU is directly on the motherboard. The RAM sticks are on the motherboard. The hard drives are not on the motherboard. They're not on the motherboard. They're connected to the motherboard with a cable which plugs in behind my you can't see it's behind my graphics card. I'll be taking the graphics card out in a minute. So those discs are connected to the motherboard with a cable. What that means, there's no bus, there's no direct bus, data transfer bus between the CPU and your storage drives. That means that your CPU cannot directly access the data on your hard disk or your SSD or solid state drive. Cannot directly access them. If I was to put in that Saving Private Ryan Blu-ray disc into my CD-ROM drive, which is up here, it wouldn't be able to directly access that either. That's also connected to the motherboard with the cable. There's no bus between them. So that's slower. That is slower. Okay? That presents a problem. I've worked with a lot of you before. We have some new students here as well, like Ronan from other dojos. One, I'm not sure what is the situation in the Kinsale dojo, Ronan, but I've worked with a lot of kids in our dojo who have very slow laptops. I think it's fair to say. And I think all of you out there who have mentored before have worked with kids who have very slow laptops. The reason some of those laptops are very slow is because they might have a very small amount of RAM. Think about that from a speed perspective. Your CPU can access all the data in your RAM very quickly because they're directly connected by a bus. The CPU cannot directly access the data on the hard drives because there's no direct bus. Okay? That means if the CPU wants to execute a Python program, and the Python program is stored on your disk, before the CPU can execute the instructions of that program with the arithmetic and logic unit like we saw, the program has to be taken from the disk, from this guy, and has to be moved to the computer into the sticks of RAM just before it gets to the CPU. That's the key fundamental thing. We're not just talking about computer hardware here, we're talking about computer architecture. Another word for this is what we call systems organization. How are all our hardware components of the computer organized together, right? If I write a Python program and I want to execute it, the CPU cannot access my code on my hard drives. It has to be here in the RAM, at least, right? That takes time. Accessing secondary storage is slow. Unlike accessing the RAM, which is very fast, accessing the hard drives or the Blu-ray disc or my USB drive, I have a USB drive here, that's slow. It's not as fast as the data being immediately available in the RAM of the computer. So when we work with kids at the laptop who have very slow computers, or they would, what we used to see, I think years ago, Caleb and I had the memories of doing the Android class, and we had kids trying to run Android Studio. Android Studio, the Android emulator, used to take up a lot of memory. They consume a lot of memory. If you only have 2 gigabytes of RAM, for example, in your computer, and most of that 2 gigabytes is taken up by Android Studio and the Android emulator or any other programs you're running, the RAM will not be able to fit all the data needed for the CPU to run all of its programs. So if all the data required to run all of the programs in your computer are not readily accessible on the RAM, where do they go? Hands up. Where's the only other place they can be stored if the RAM is full? Connor.
In the hard drive?
Correct. In the hard drive. Perfect, Connor. Thank you. Excellent. In the hard drive. If your programs and your data won't fit in your RAM, the only other place they can go is your hard drive. During the operating system classes, we were talking about how to schedule the data, all the programs that get time in our CPU to execute. There's another form of scheduling the operating system has to do as well. How does it make sure all the necessary data from your hard disk is in the RAM when it's needed by a running program? Your computer is going to slow down and run very slowly if you have very limited amounts of RAM, and there's not enough RAM in your computer to store all the data needed for your running programs. In that case, as Connor said, the data or the programs will need to be swapped out. I use that word deliberately for people who know what a swap file is. That data needs to be swapped out to your hard disk. If the CPU then looks for data and the data is not in the RAM, then the computer will have to request that the program or the data or the files or whatever get transferred from your disk into the RAM. That's going to slow your program down. It's going to slow your whole computer down. And that's why a common way to speed up a computer is to add more RAM. If you have more RAM, there's more data that can be directly accessed by your CPU in a very fast way. So you can speed up the responsiveness of your computer. You can make programs run faster if you have more RAM, because the computer doesn't need to spend lots of time swapping data from the RAM into your hard disks. That's a slow operation. Here we go. Isn't this fascinating, guys? That's pretty much all I wanted to say about memory and storage, guys. Does anybody have any questions about that before we move on? You're very quiet tonight, guys. I hope that's a good thing. I hope you're taking all this in. Okay. Very good. So, Connor, go for it.
So, like, say you had a lot of RAM, but it's terrible CPU. But that also be super slow because the CPU isn't getting to the RAM quick enough.
You were kind of breaking up there a bit, Connor. You said, imagine you have lots and lots of RAM, and then what next?
A lot of RAM, the CPU would also be like slow because the CPU isn't getting to the quick enough.
Oh, you're saying if you've okay, because you were breaking up. I think you were breaking up there, Connor. If you've lots of RAM, but the CPU is slow, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well yeah, that would slow you down as well, of course. Well, because you also have things in your CPU called the clock speed. It's the amount of instructions that your processor can execute. It's how fast your CPU can execute all these instructions. If you have a slow CPU,
A bad CPU.
that might be a better way of putting it. I'm not sure, Connor. That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to, because the reason I said maybe Caleb's description is better, because
I think he did say bad CPU.
Huh?
I think he did say bad CPU.
I said bad.
Oh, bad. Okay. Well, you see, if it's a bad CPU, There's two things I can think of. First of all, your CPU might not just be able to execute instructions very fast, regardless of whether the data is in the RAM or not. Okay, that's one thing. Okay, but the other thing is, like, does the slowness of a CPU impact the speed at which data goes from the RAM to the CPU chip? That I don't know, to be honest with you. So I would imagine the answer is yes, Connor. Like, adding loads and loads of memory to a computer will help your computer seem more responsive, but it won't necessarily result in a massive speed up. And that's a word we use in computer science sometimes, is speed up. Like, what is the factor by which your computer is now able to do things a lot faster? So just adding lots and lots and lots of RAM with a sole CPU, there will be a point where adding more and more RAM is not going to make it go any faster, because your bottleneck will then become how quickly the CPU is able to process all the instructions from the RAM, if you get me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. And likewise, the other way around, you can have a very, very, very fast CPU and, I don't know, 512 megabytes of RAM. That'd be terrible. You know? So that's why normally to make your computer faster, you'd say, yeah, add CPU, but it's not always CPU you need to add. You might need to, when I say add CPU, I mean like upgrade to a better processor, right? But you need to consider adding memory as well. Okay.
I think there is a similar thing going on with if the CPU cache is too small, where it has to offload things to the next more abundant source of memory, which will be slower.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that reminds me, I have, let me share my screen again for a second. I have a, where is it? Share. Down here. Look at all the stuff I put the former students of my dojo class through. It was terrible. What was I thinking? There's a diagram. It's called a memory hierarchy. You can see like what's the fastest and what's the slowest. What's the most costly to access, or the least, sorry, costly in financial terms. You've got registers at the top. Access, this is access time from the CPU. Registers being the fastest. An L1 cache, that stands for level 1. An L2 cache. These things here, registers L1 and L2, tend to be on the CPU chip. Then you have main memory. Then you have your hard drive, CD-ROM, and then a tape backup. That's pretty ancient, it has to be said. As you go down the pyramid, you're getting further away from the CPU, which means you're getting slower, but it also means they're cheaper. Tape backup is dirt cheap. So there you go. Primary memory, everything up here above hard drive is always the fastest. Okay. Right, let's move on because we only have 10 minutes left, and I want this to be the only session on computer architecture, so we'll try and get this out of the way. What we might do then next week is move on to, say, computer networking, the internet. Okay, so the next thing, the final thing then to talk about really is input-output devices. Let me turn off the screen share for a moment. Okay, right, question for all of you. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen the inside of a computer before, and I'm going to turn on my torch again. Okay, it's getting darker and darker outside. There's my computer. We've seen things up the top, the processor, the memory. The next thing I want to talk about is essentially input-output devices, means by which we send, or devices that allow us to send data into the computer, and devices that allow us to send to get data out of the computer. Now, looking at my my computer there, I'm sure there's people out there familiar enough with what's probably in my computer. Can anybody spot an input-output device? There's more than one inside my computer here connected to the motherboard. Who put their hands up there? I think Connor got there first. Connor?
There's like the HDMI port on the graphics card.
Yes, the graphics card essentially. Yes, exactly. So the port on the graphics card connects to a memory, but the input-output device itself is the graphics card. Excellent. Okay. Ian, did you spot something else in there by any chance? Aside from the
Not
graphics
really
card?
visible by your I/O shield, where literally all of your input and outputs are.
Say that again.
Your I/O shield.
That's right, yeah. But I have several devices plugged into the Shield, yeah. Niall?
Would USB ports count?
Yeah, they would. Yeah, absolutely. The USB ports are actually connected by a cable. The cable for the USB ports is down there. They're connected to the USB ports. Also, there's USB ports on the back there. What am I saying? Yeah, exactly. So these are all input-output devices. Now, can anybody think of input-output devices that are not inside the computer? Hands up. Niall?
Like a CD drive?
Yeah, true. That is put into the computer. You could have an external CD drive, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Ian, I think, do you have another suggestion?
Yeah, mouse, keyboard, camera or mic.
Yeah, perfect. Keyboard, which I have here, and my mouse, and webcam. Hello. Those are all input-output devices. So my webcam is an input into my computer. It allows you to see me, and actually, in this case, it's also my microphone. The keyboard allows us to send data into the computer, as does the mouse.
That's a cool mouse, Matt.
That's the Logitech mouse. Yeah, I bought that before the pandemic, actually, when I got my
Oh, I have the same mouse actually.
Oh, cool. Let's just ditch
Sorry,
the
carry
past
on.
and let's just talk about my steak, you know? Yeah, no, it's a Logitech Magic Mouse. Yeah, it's really nice. Where was I? No, I said the CD drive. So that the CD drive is an interesting one, actually, because the CD drive could be an input-output device, because, of course, your computer can read from a CD drive, but it can also write to a CD drive. Can anybody spot any other input-output devices on my desk? Yeah, Niall?
Monitor?
Perfect. Thank you, Niall. Yeah, the monitor is an output device, and that's connected to the computer, the motherboard, via the HDMI port on the graphics card. Yeah, as Connor said earlier, exactly. So yeah, the monitor is an output device. Exactly. So we've input-output devices that allow us to interface with our system. But what I'd like to talk to you about is, how do all of those things actually work in terms of transmitting data in and out of the system? So we talked about things like the monitor, which is connected to the graphics card via a HDMI cable. But think about this now for a second. We have the graphics card here. For those who are wondering, it's an EVGA GeForce RTX 2080 Ti. Please be jealous.
Jealous.
Huh?
I said jealous.
You're jealous, Connor, right? Excellent.
Imagine we had to buy a graphics card in 2021.
That's true. I want to get a 3080, but like they're all can't be got. Anyway, let's say that your CPU. I know. Let's say you. Oh yeah, actually, we have a good example of this. Let's say you have a Python program. We've all done some Python programming here in this class. That writes something like, it prints the result of an operation. In fact, we see it all the time, because where's my my Visual Studio Code here? We have an instruction like this: print. Print has to print data out. In this case, it has to print out something, a string out to the console here. So let's just pretend, for example, that your CPU encounters an instruction in your program to send data out to the monitor of the user. Okay? In my computer, the monitor is connected to the graphics card via HDMI cable. But how does the CPU send an instruction to the graphics card to output data onto the monitors? Any thoughts? And we've seen an example of it already. The answer is a bus. The CPU has a bus. The CPU has a bus to talk to the RAM. So we know about that bus, it's on the motherboard. But there's also something called a PCI bus. This graphics card, I'm going to actually, this be exciting here. I'm going to take the graphics card out of the computer. Let me put my anti-static strap on again. I'm going to need two hands actually to take out the graphics card, because it's big, so bear with me there a second. So I'll take out the graphics card. which I unplugged earlier in anticipation. So here's the graphics card. It's very big. We've got the pins along the edge there. Okay, I'm going to put the graphics card over here for a second. Where have I put that? Sorry, no, right. I just want to be careful. It's quite expensive. Now, connected there. Now let me bring the camera. Now that I've taken the card out. You see the slot there? That's a PCI slot. And isn't it how embarrassing? I've forgotten what PCI stands for. Is it like peripheral component interface or something? Can anybody tell me what PCI stands for? I'm not asking the question. Somebody just tell me, as I've forgotten. PCI. I think it's something like peripheral component interface.
Interconnect apparently.
So what's the full abbreviation, Alan?
Peripheral component interconnect.
And you're right, it is interconnect. Now that my memory comes back to you, thank you, Alan. Yeah, it is interconnect. Yeah, peripheral component interconnect. So the graphics card is a PCI device, a peripheral component interconnect. I have another one up there, that little red card. That's an extra port for allowing me to connect a hard drive. And down here, I have a sound card. That's a sound card. So my speakers are connected to that. That's another output device. So I have several PCI slots on my computer. And my motherboard, everybody's motherboard, has a PCI bus that allows your computer, your CPU, whatever, to talk and send instructions to or receive data from all the PCI devices. Okay. The other thing, maybe just before we finish up there, just a note to you. Let me turn the thing back on. There's the battery, by the way. Do you see the Duracell battery, the round silver thing? Ian, you were wondering about the clock ticks. How did the computer keep time last week? There's the battery that's needed to keep the time on the motherboard when the computer switched off. And there over here, see all those cables there? They're the cables connecting the hard drives to my motherboard. All right. You have the power supply cable there. That's the power supply cable up there. Whatnot. Yeah. Niall.
Does the motherboard still use the battery even if it's connected to the internet?
Does the motherboard still use the how do you mean, Niall?
Like, you know, when the motherboard is on, does it still use the battery to power itself to keep track of the...
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, good, very good question. What happens is on your Windows system, as an example, you know, your Windows system talks to the internet to get the time. There's a Microsoft Windows time server, okay? And periodically, your Windows operating system, because remember, as we learned last week and the week before, when your computer is turned on, control of the hardware of the computer is handed over to the operating system. So the operating system is responsible for managing all the hardware components. So when you turn on your computer and Windows boots up and it connects to the Windows time server to get the time, Windows will essentially keep track of the time, and the time will be stored on a device on the motherboard by Windows. Okay, so it's true that when the computer is turned on, that Windows can grab the time from the time server, but the time that it reads has to be stored on the motherboard. Okay, so that again, when you turn off the computer, it'll keep track of time. And to further that point, what happens when your battery dies, of course? When your battery dies, and it's happened to mine several times, when your battery dies, you turn on your computer's lost track of time. When you log into Windows, the time will be incorrect. Windows will then talk to the time server, get the time, and it will keep that time. It should keep that time for the duration of your system. But I have seen it where my battery is low, and it'll grab the time from the Windows server, keep it for a while, and then forget the time again. So I can't give you a complete solid answer now. I just don't know what's the full sequence there. But your Windows operating system is supposed to sync the time with your motherboard, okay? There's an area of memory in your motherboard called a CMOS, where that data is stored when the computer is turned off. And the battery is responsible for keeping that in check when the computer is turned off. But you're right, it does read the time from the internet. And when the computer is turned on, I think it should continue to keep the time in Windows, but it should sync it to the motherboard. But I have seen it lose the time when the battery's low, even when the computer's on. So I'm not completely sure on that one, I'm afraid. Very good question. Very good question. So to finish up today, because we're just after 9:30, just to finish off, I just want to show you one last diagram. I'm sharing the wrong screen now. Hang on. Stop sharing. Share screen. Here. I'll just show you all this in a diagram. So you've seen our input-output devices. You can see again here, this is a very simplified diagram of how the hard drive, your keyboard, your monitor, etc. They all talk to each other using a bus, which is this line here. Okay, there is a control. You can see here, there's this idea of a controller, say for the monitor, a video controller. The video controller is actually essentially it's a piece of that in this case is your graphics card. That's what your video controller is. But the diagram I wanted to show you is this one here. You've got your PCI bridge. It connects, you can see there, it's connected to the CPU, it's connected to the main memory, and it's connected to all the devices that are plugged into a PCI slot, like the graphics card or the network controller. In my computer, I don't have a PCI device for a network controller. This is a very old diagram, obviously. Modem. But you see there's a bus that allows all of these things to talk to each other. Okay, so there's a bus between the CPU and the main memory, but it also talks to the PCI, the CPI bridge, which is here, which connects to the PCI bus. So the graphics card, the sound card, all those things in there all connect with a PCI bus, and that's how they can send their data to the CPU or the main memory. The other thing I wanted to talk about tonight, but we're out of time and I won't, is interrupts. Maybe we'll talk a bit about that the next time at the start of the next session. I think interrupts are important, especially in the context of the operating systems. An interrupt is whenever you plug a device into your computer, a signal known as an interrupt is sent to the system. That's how the computer knows what to do with this, but I won't get into any more than that tonight. Okay, so guys, that's the end of it for now. Does anybody have any? I've dismantled my computer for you. You're welcome. I've put it back together now. Oh no, hope that it's not broken. Does anybody at the dojo in IBM? I actually had motherboards and memory all outside of a computer to show, but I don't have any spare motherboards or anything here, so I had to use my own computer for tonight's session. So there we go. So does anybody have any questions for me before we finish up and stop the recording? Anything at all? No? Excellent. That's perfect. I hope that means I've done a good job explaining things. So, I guess I wasn't fully prepared for the two's complement number systems discussion, but maybe another time for that. All right. Well, in that case, so guys, we'll leave it. I'll stop the recording. I'll make that available on the YouTube channel. Okay, cool. So